Before we begin, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, leave a like if these stories move you, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence here keeps stories like this alive. I still remember the sound of the slap. It wasn't just a strike, it was a crack that split my world in two. I can still feel the sting on my cheek, the metallic taste of tears mixed with silence. I was standing in the kitchen, wearing the same faded blue dress I used during pregnancy, my body still sore from giving birth only 2 weeks earlier. The smell of spoiled garbage filled the house, crawling through every corner like a reminder of my failure. The flies buzzed over the bean that had turned into a nest of maggots. He hadn't taken it out for days, even though I had begged him to. And when I asked again, just after coming home from the hospital, I saw in his eyes that something in him was gone. Or maybe it had never been there to begin with. He was a banker, always so pristine in his suits, his hair combed perfectly, the scent of expensive cologne hiding the stench of hypocrisy. People admired him, called him a provider, a good man, and me. I was the woman who had everything, yet couldn't stop crying over dirty floors and empty bottles. The argument started small, like they always do. I asked if he'd cleaned. He said I was ungrateful. I said something about his mother. God, why did I say that? And his hand came down before I even realized I had pushed him too far. When he hit me, the baby started crying in the next room. That cry, it pierced through me like a knife. I remember holding my face, feeling it burn, and whispering, not in front of him. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, a look of disgust, maybe shame, and walked away. I sank to the floor, surrounded by trash, milk bottles, and a silence that screamed louder than any fight. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the crib, watching my son's chest rise and fall, wondering how I had gotten there. I was once full of dreams. I wanted to be a teacher, maybe even travel. But somewhere along the way, I traded ambition for love, and love for survival. Every sacrifice I made had been a brick in the walls that now trapped me. At dawn, I looked out the window and saw him leaving for work, like nothing had happened. He adjusted his tie, locked the door behind him, and disappeared into the street, his world untouched, mine shattered. And as the sunlight touched the pile of garbage he'd refused to take out, I realized something for the first time. This house wasn't my home anymore. It was a cage. I touched my cheek again, still swollen, and made myself a promise in silence, one I would take years to fulfill. I promised that my son would never grow up thinking love was something that hurts. But I didn't know then that the worst was still waiting, and that the next time he came home, it wouldn't be with silence, but with lipstick stains and lies. It was late when I heard his car pull into the driveway, the low hum of the engine crawling through the night like a warning. My son was asleep, the faint rhythm of his breathing the only sound in the small house. I remember glancing at the clock to 37 a.m. I'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks that looked like veins spreading through plaster, wondering if they mirrored the ones forming inside me. When the door opened, the smell hit first: whiskey, cheap perfume, and smoke. I could tell before he even stepped into the light that something was different. His tie was loose, his shirt untucked, and there were lipstick stains on his collar, not subtle, not accidental. Red, the kind of red that screams and mocks at the same time. He froze when he saw me standing in the hallway, holding the baby's blanket in my hands. "You're awake," he said, his voice slurred, his tone defensive before I even asked a thing. "Where were you?" My voice didn't sound like mine. It was too calm, too quiet, the kind of calm that comes after you've cried so much there's nothing left to give. "Work party," he said. "You know that." I stared at the stains. "Do they serve lipstick at those parties now?" He sighed, rubbed his temples, and gave a small, pitiful laugh. "You're paranoid, always twisting things. God, can't you just be normal, normal?" I used to love that word. Normal was what I wanted. A house, a husband, a baby, dinners where no one yelled. But that night, normal became poison in my mouth. He stumbled to the couch, dropped his jacket, and poured himself another drink. I could hear the ice crack in the glass, sharp and cruel. "You humiliate me," he said after a long silence. "Always making me the bad guy. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Pressure." That's what he called it. The same man who hadn't changed a single diaper, who hadn't wiped the floor or comforted a crying child in months. I felt something inside me break, but this time it wasn't my heart, it was the illusion. I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. Or maybe I had never really known him. He passed out on the couch before I could say another word. The TV flickered in the background, casting shadows across his face. I watched him sleep, not with tenderness, but with disbelief. I remembered the man I fell in love with, the one who brought flowers, who called me his angel, who said he wanted a family more than anything. Where had that man gone? Maybe he never existed. Maybe he was just a story I told myself to survive the loneliness. I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked older, harder. My hands trembled as I touched the bruise on my cheek that hadn't completely faded. Behind me, I could still hear him snoring, loud, careless, safe in his own world. And I thought, this is what my life has become, cleaning up after someone who destroys everything he touches. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed the baby, drank his coffee, and left for work. I sat there, holding the empty cup he'd used, staring at the faint trace of lipstick still clinging to his collar. That was the day I stopped asking questions. Because every answer hurt more than the silence. But fate is cruel, silence doesn't last. And soon, I would learn that even when you think you've reached the end of your suffering, life finds a way to test how much pain you can still endure. I don't remember much of that morning, just the sound of the rain against the kitchen window and the smell of burnt toast. My hands were shaking as I poured coffee I couldn't drink. He'd left early again, no note, no goodbye. Just the lingering echo of his cologne mixed with stale whiskey. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the heartbeat of my baby sleeping in the next room. I went to the clinic because I couldn't stop feeling dizzy. I thought maybe it was exhaustion. I hadn't slept properly in weeks, not since that night. But when the nurse took my blood and the doctor called me back into the room, I saw something in her eyes that froze me. "Congratulations," she said softly. "You're about 6 weeks along," her voice echoed. 6 weeks along. The room began to tilt. I stared at the little plastic stick she placed on the counter, the 2 pink lines like cruel jokes drawn by fate. I pressed my hand to my stomach, but all I could feel was the weight of fear pressing back. I walked home under the rain without an umbrella. The city felt grey, blurred, as if the world itself was trying to fade away. Every step echoed with the same thought, not again, not now. When I told him that night, he didn't even look up from his dinner plate. "Another one," he said flatly, cutting his steak as if I'd just told him we were out of milk. I felt my throat tighten. "Yes," I whispered. "Another one," he sighed, shaking his head. "We can barely afford the first." "You can't even handle him without falling apart." Those words burned deeper than any slap ever could. I watched his hands steady, deliberate, as he cut through the meat. It was like watching someone dissect my hope piece by piece. He didn't say another word that night. Just left the table, went to his office, and closed the door. I sat there for hours, listening to the clock tick, the rain falling harder outside, and the sound of my own heart breaking quietly in the dark. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself that maybe, somehow, things would get better. I imagined the baby's face, tried to feel love instead of fear. But every time I looked at my reflection, all I saw was a woman trapped between duty and despair, a ghost wearing a smile for a man who had stopped seeing her years ago. Then one afternoon, I found something. I wasn't looking for it. I was just cleaning, folding laundry, trying to keep busy. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. I knew I shouldn't, but something inside me whispered, "Look." It was a message. A woman's name. "Had a great time last night. Wish you'd stayed longer." I felt the air leave my lungs. The room seemed to close in on me. I scrolled further, pictures, words, promises he'd never made to me. My fingers trembled as I put the phone down, terrified he might walk in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling again, the same cracks, the same shadows. Except this time, I wasn't afraid of being alone, I was afraid of staying. I realized the truth that every woman dreads. Love wasn't what chained me to him anymore. It was fear. Fear of the world outside, fear of starting over, fear of raising two children alone. But as I lay there, one hand on my belly, I felt a faint flutter, small, fragile, alive. The second heartbeat. It was like the world whispered to me, "Don't give up." And in that moment, between silence and tears, I made a promise, not to him, not even to the baby, but to myself. One day, I would leave. I didn't know when or how, but I would find the strength to walk away from the man who had already buried the woman I used to be. It happened on a Tuesday night, the kind of night that feels ordinary until it isn't. The air was thick with summer heat, heavy enough to make the curtains stick to the windows. He came home late again, smelling of gin and perfume that wasn't mine. I could hear him stumbling in the hallway before he even reached the door. I had just put our son to sleep. The house was finally quiet, and I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the sink piled high with dishes. My belly had started to show by then just a gentle curve, a reminder that life kept growing inside me, even as everything else seemed to rot. When he walked in, he didn't say hello. He threw his jacket on the chair, muttered something about dinner, and looked around the kitchen like he was inspecting a battlefield. "You didn't even clean up?" he asked, his voice sharp, slicing through the silence. "I was tired," I said softly. "I just needed to rest a little." He laughed cold, bitter. "Rest? From what? You don't work. You just sit here all day." Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the hormones, or the months of pretending everything was fine. I turned to him, shaking. "You think this isn't work? You think carrying your child, cleaning, cooking, keeping this house from falling apart isn't enough?" His eyes darkened. "Watch your tone," but I didn't. I couldn't stop. "Maybe if you were half the man you pretend to be at that dam bank, this house wouldn't smell like garbage and broken promises." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then it came, his hand, fast and loud against my face. The sound of it cracked through the air like thunder. I stumbled, my cheek burning, my heart pounding so hard I thought the baby would feel it. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes cold. Then he said, "You brought this on yourself." I didn't cry, not then. I remember touching my face, feeling the sting, and realizing that something had died in me at that exact moment. The woman who loved him, who defended him, who made excuses, she was gone. He went to bed, and I sat on the kitchen floor until the sun came up. I could hear the baby's soft breathing in the next room, the sound of a world that still had innocence left. I whispered to myself, over and over, "You can't stay. You can't stay." But I did. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to leave. The world outside those walls seemed just as cruel, just as uncertain. And yet, every day after that night, I started saving little pieces of courage coins from the grocery change, small lies about errands, stolen minutes where I imagined freedom. One evening, I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My cheek had healed, but my eyes hadn't. They looked older, distant. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. I whispered to her, "Soon." Then, almost like fate heard me, something happened. His boss called one night while he was out drinking. A woman's voice. She asked for him, then hesitated. There was something in her tone, hesitation, maybe pity. When I told her he wasn't home, she said quietly, "Tell him his wife called." I froze. His wife. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, my reflection staring back at me from the kitchen window. I realized then that I wasn't married to a man anymore. I was married to a stranger, a liar, someone capable of breaking me and building another life somewhere else at the same time. That night, as he slept beside me, I lay awake, planning my escape for real this time. My fingers traced the small bump on my belly as I whispered a promise into the dark. "We're leaving soon. I swear it." And though I didn't know when or how, I could feel it in my bones. The breaking point wasn't the slap, or the lies, or even the loneliness. It was realizing that the life I was living had already ended. All that was left was to bury it and find a way to start again. If you've come this far, you already feel the weight of her silence. Take a second to like this video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your corner of the world. I want to know where this story has reached you. I didn't plan to die. Not really. I only planned to disappear, to vanish quietly from a world that had already buried me in silence. But the line between running away and dying blurred so easily that I stopped knowing which one I was chasing. It started on a rainy Thursday in 1984. The city was drenched, the sky a dull, bruised grey, and the gutters overflowed with dirty water. He had left early for work, still half drunk from the night before. The apartment smelled like whiskey, cologne, and regret. I packed slowly, methodically. A small suitcase, one pair of jeans, a blouse, the baby's blanket, a few photographs. Nothing that would draw suspicion. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The kind that tastes like iron on your tongue, the kind that tells you there's no turning back. I had saved $612.47. Every cent counted, tucked away in an envelope inside a flour jar. I carried it in my bra, close to my heart, as if it were the only thing keeping it beating. The baby was just 3 months old, small enough to fit in the crook of my arm, light enough to carry into a new life. His eyes were so pure, so untouched by the chaos that had swallowed me. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "We're going somewhere safe, sweetheart." Somewhere new. The plan was simple and desperate. I would take the morning bus to Charleston, use a fake name, Helen Parker, and find work in one of those small diners that never ask too many questions. But as the bus pulled away from the station, I caught sight of the reflection in the window, my wedding ring still on my finger. I slid it off and let it drop to the floor. The sound it made, a tiny metallic click, felt like the sound of my old life ending. By the time he realized I was gone, it would be too late. At least, that's what I thought. But men like him, they don't let go easily. Especially not of something they think they own. For weeks I hid. I rented a room above a laundromat where the smell of detergent never left the air. I worked in a diner called Maggie's Grill, serving coffee to truckers and tired mothers. No one looked twice at me. That anonymity felt like heaven. But then came the newspaper article. I was wiping tables when I saw it, my picture, right there on the front page of the Charleston Gazette. Young mother missing, police fear foul play. The story said I'd been last seen leaving the apartment building. Neighbors claimed they'd heard a fight that night. My husband told the reporters he was heartbroken, that he just wanted his wife and baby home safe. Heartbroken. I nearly laughed. Or maybe I screamed, I'm not sure which. The lies looked so real in print. His tears in the photo looked convincing, like he was auditioning for sainthood. That's when the idea hit me, not to hide, but to die. If I was dead, he couldn't find me. He couldn't hurt me again. He couldn't make me crawl back into the prison I'd escaped. So I wrote a letter. Simple, short, believable. I said I couldn't handle the pressure, that I'd walked into the river and left the baby somewhere safe. I left the letter in a phone booth near the pier, tucked under the receiver, and let the wind carry away the rest of my fear. That night, I stood by the water and watched the moon shimmer across the surface. The river looked endless, dark, and strangely comforting. I imagined my old self sinking beneath it, the girl who once believed in fairy tale love, in promises whispered between champagne kisses. The next morning, they found my car by the riverbank, the door open, my shoes neatly placed by the edge. I was gone. For everyone who knew me, I had drowned. For him, I was just another tragedy to polish his reputation. But for me, it was the first day of being alive. I didn't attend my own funeral right away. That came later, much later. But even as I lived under another name, in another town, I could feel the ghost of that woman haunting me. She wanted to see how the world mourned her, or if it did at all. And when that moment finally came, I realized something far darker than I was prepared for. It was autumn of 1985 when I saw my own name carved in stone. Helen Parker was long gone by then. I had become Martha, a quiet woman living in a town no one ever visited twice. My hair had grown grey early, my hands had hardened from dish soap and double shifts, but my heart had learned silence. Then one morning, a waitress I worked with brought in an old newspaper she'd used to wrap her lunch. The date on it was faded, but I saw the headline clear as daylight: Beloved banker's wife laid to rest, community mourns tragic loss. For a long minute, I couldn't breathe. I felt the room tilt, as if gravity had changed its mind. The photo below the headline was me, or what was left of the woman I used to be. My husband stood beside the coffin, black suit, somber face, hand over his heart. The caption said, "A devoted husband bidding farewell to his late wife, devoted." I laughed out loud too loud. The sound startled the other waitress, and she asked if I was okay. I told her I'd bitten my tongue, but inside, something had cracked open. I needed to see it. I don't know why, maybe for closure, maybe for proof that I really existed once. So I took the bus back to my hometown, wearing a faded brown coat and oversized sunglasses that swallowed half my face. I told myself I'd just look from afar, just one glance. The church smelled the same old wood, lilies, and dust. Through the cracked door, I saw the people gathered inside. Neighbors, relatives, women who used to whisper about my perfect marriage. They cried softly, dabbing their eyes, as if grief could erase all the times they looked away. And there he was, standing by my coffin, hands folded, face heavy with full sorrow. His mother clutched his arm, whispering, "She's in a better place now." I wanted to scream, "No, I'm not. I'm right here." But instead, I stood in the shadows, the smell of rain clinging to my coat. The preacher spoke about love, forgiveness, eternal rest. I stared at the coffin, wondering whose body they buried in my place. A stranger, maybe a Jane Doe the authorities couldn't identify. Whoever she was, I owed her my freedom. When the service ended, I stayed behind the corner of the old oak tree and watched as they lowered the casket. The sound of soil hitting wood echoed like thunder in my chest. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from sobbing. It felt like I was watching my own heart being buried. After the crowd left, he stayed alone by the grave. His expression softened, not with grief, but with guilt or maybe fear. He whispered something I couldn't hear, then placed a single red rose on top. That's when I saw her. A woman standing by his car, tall, blonde, younger than me by at least 15 years. She leaned against the door, smoking, wearing his jacket. He walked toward her, touched her waist, and kissed her right there, in the same suit he wore to mourn me. I think that was the moment I truly died. Not the river, not the fake letter, this. Watching him move on so easily, so shamelessly, as if I had been nothing but an inconvenience to bury. I turned away and walked down the dirt path. My legs trembled, but my steps grew faster. The wind blew through the trees, carrying the last words of the preacher, "May she rest in peace," and for the first time I whispered back, "Yes. Let her rest," but I didn't rest. I built a new life, far from that graveyard, far from that man. Still, a part of me stayed there beneath the earth, beside the woman whose name I borrowed for freedom. Years later, I'd look back and realize that my funeral wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of haunting, the kind where you walk the world as both the living and the dead. I still remember the first time I laughed again. Really laughed, not the polite kind that slips out by habit, but the kind that shakes your ribs and leaves your eyes wet. It was in 1987, in a diner off Route 17. During a night shift when the power went out, someone spilled coffee, the jukebox died mid-song, and for a second, the whole place fell into darkness. Then old Maggie, the owner, the one who hired me without asking for a single reference, struck a match, lit a candle, and said, "Well, looks like God's giving us a break from pretending." Everyone laughed, including me. I don't know why it hit me so hard, but it did. I leaned against the counter, my hand on my chest, feeling the sound vibrate through me like something alive. After years of silence, that small, ridiculous laugh felt like resurrection. Life didn't become easy after that, it never really does, but it became mine. I learned how to be invisible and indispensable at the same time. The regulars at the diner called me Martha, the quiet one with tired eyes and steady hands. I rented a small apartment above a hardware store. The floor creaked when I walked, the pipes moaned at night, and the wallpaper peeled like old skin, but it was home. A place no one yelled. A place that smelled of soap and coffee, not whiskey and regret. My son, my only connection to the woman I used to be, grew fast. I told people his father had died, that we were starting over after a terrible accident. The lie tasted strange at first, bitter and heavy, but with time, it became just another truth I carried. I worked double shifts to pay for his daycare, then his school. Every night, when I tucked him in, I'd whisper, "We're safe, love. We're safe now," and for a long time, I believed it. Until one day, the past found a way to knock on my door again. It was a Thursday in the spring of 1992. I came home from work to find a letter slipped under my door. No return address, just my name. Not Martha, my real name. My dead name. My hands shook so hard the paper tore as I opened it. Inside, only one sentence, typed neatly on a small piece of paper. "You can't hide forever." No signature. No clue, just those 4 words. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time the phone rang, my chest tightened. Every shadow in the hallway became his silhouette. I stopped answering the door, stopped talking to anyone. My son was 7 by then, bright, curious, innocent. I tried to hide my fear, but children feel things. He'd touch my face and ask, "Mommy, why do you look sad when no one's watching?" One night, as I was locking the windows, I saw him, or thought I did. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, a man in a grey coat, smoking. He didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. When I blinked, he was gone. The next morning, I packed again. Not to disappear this time, but to run forward, not backward. We moved to another state, Virginia, where no one knew the woman in the papers or the ghost who left her shoes by the river. I changed my last name again, burned the letter, started over again. Years passed, and the fear dulled like an old scar. My son grew tall, his hair the same dark brown as his father's, but his eyes softer, kinder. I never told him the truth, not then. I couldn't risk it. To him, I was just Martha, the quiet mother who worked too much and loved him more than air. But deep down, I knew the past never really dies. It waits. It lingers. It finds its way through the cracks you thought were sealed. And when it came back the next time, it didn't come for me. It came for him. He was 17 when the call came. I still remember the way the phone rang that night, sharp, insistent, like it already knew it was bringing bad news. It was past midnight, and I was half asleep on the couch, the TV murmuring some late-night talk show I wasn't really watching. My heart dropped before I even picked up the receiver. Mothers always know when it's about their children, Mrs. Parker, a voice said. This is Officer Daniels from Richmond Police. Your son's been in an accident. The world split into again, just like it had the night of that first slap, decades earlier. My hands went cold, and I remember whispering, "Is he alive?" The officer paused, the kind of pause that makes time stop. Then, "Yes, ma'am. He's hurt, but alive." I don't remember how I got to the hospital. Just flashes, headlights, rain on the windshield, the smell of my own fear filling the car. When I saw him, lying on that bed, tubes running into his arms, blood dried on his hairline, I felt that same helplessness crawl back through. Except this time, I wasn't the victim. I was the mother. He'd been driving with friends. Someone ran a red light, a collision. The kind of thing that happens every day, that ruins a handful of lives in an instant. The doctor said he'd be okay, that it was a miracle. But when I took his hand, I realized something else was broken, not in his body, but in the story I'd built around us. Because when he opened his eyes, the first thing he said was, "Mom, they said there's a man here looking for you." The words hit harder than the accident ever could. "What man?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. He frowned slightly, his eyelids heavy from morphine. He said he was my father. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I looked around the room, half expecting to see a familiar shadow in the corner. But there was only the hum of the machines, the faint smell of antiseptic, and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I waited until he fell asleep, then went to the nurse's station. "Did anyone come asking for us?" I asked. The nurse checked the visitor log. "Yes, ma'am. Earlier this evening. A man in his 50s. Said he was family. But he didn't leave a name." I walked out into the parking lot, the night air cold enough to sting. Every light felt too bright, every shadow too deep. It had been almost 20 years since I'd seen him, since I became a ghost, but somehow I knew. I felt him out there, watching. For days I didn't go home. I stayed by my son's bed, barely eating, barely speaking. I thought maybe if I stayed awake long enough, I could keep the past from catching up. But it doesn't work like that. The past doesn't knock anymore when it wants in, it just walks through the door. A week later, when we were finally discharged, a letter was waiting in our mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside, a single photograph of my son, sitting in the diner parking lot, his backpack slung over one shoulder, smiling, unaware. The photo was new.recent. On the back, written in that same neat, deliberate handwriting as before, were just 3 words, "He deserves truth." I burned the photograph, but the words stayed. That night, I watched him sleep, this young man who had no idea how many names his mother had worn, how many ghosts she had buried just to keep him safe. And for the first time, I questioned whether I'd really saved him, or just built him a life out of lies. He woke in the middle of the night and saw me crying. "Mom," he whispered, his voice still weak, "you don't have to be scared anymore." I almost told him everything then, the river, the funeral, the man I used to love and fear. But I couldn't. The truth was a cage I wasn't ready to build around him. So I just kissed his forehead and said, "Go back to sleep, darling. It's over." But deep down, I knew it WASN single quotes T. Not yet. Because the next morning, the newspaper arrived at the diner. And there, buried on the 3rd page, was a name I hadn't seen in decades. Thomas Miller, prominent banker, found dead at 58. When I saw his name in print again, I didn't feel what I expected to. No satisfaction, no justice. Just silence, deep and hollow, like the world had held its breath and forgotten how to exhale. Thomas Miller, 58, died of an apparent heart attack at his home in Raleigh. The article said he'd been beloved by his colleagues, that he leaves behind his devoted wife, Linda, and their two daughters. I stared at the words, my fingers trembling on the thin paper, the ink smudging beneath my touch. He'd replaced us, built a new life on top of the ruins of mine, and somehow, even that life was already gone. For years I'd imagined what I'd do if I ever saw him again. I pictured screaming, spitting truth into his face, or maybe just walking away without a word, stronger than he'd ever imagined I could be. But in the end, he died quietly, without my permission, without my closure. Death had stolen even that from me. I closed the diner early that day. Maggie was gone by then, past 2 winters earlier, and the new manager, a kid young enough to be my grandson, didn't ask questions when I said I wasn't feeling well. I walked home under a pale afternoon sky, the kind of sky that feels like it's hiding something. Every step echoed like a memory. When I got home, I pulled the envelope of old papers from the back of my closet, the ones I swore I'd never open again. Inside was a faded photograph of me at 26, holding my baby. My eyes in that photo were wide, hopeful, unbroken. I barely recognized her anymore. That night, I dreamed of the river. The same river where I had left my shoes, where I had buried my name. I dreamed I was standing on its edge again, but this time I wasn't afraid. The water was calm, almost kind. I heard a voice behind me, his voice calling my name, the real one, the one I hadn't heard in decades. I turned, but there was no one there. Only the echo. Only the past whispering its last goodbye. The next morning, I drove. I didn't tell my son where I was going. He was grown now, 27, living in Chicago, working in marketing, too busy to call except on Sundays. He loved me, I knew that. But he loved the version of me I had invented, and sometimes that was enough. The drive took 8 hours. I didn't play music, just the sound of tires on asphalt, wind against the windows, and the rhythmic beating of my heart that felt loud in the quiet. When I reached Raleigh, the address from the newspaper was easy to find. A 2-story house with white shutters and a garden of roses that looked almost unreal. I parked across the street and watched from the car. There were people going in and out, mourners in dark clothes, carrying flowers and polite grief. And then I saw her, the woman from the funeral all those years ago. Older now, softer, her hair a paler shade of gold. She stood on the porch, greeting guests, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a young woman who looked just like him, his daughter, my son's half-sister. For a moment, I hated them, hated their comfort, their ignorance, their clean grief untouched by bruises or silence. But then something shifted. I realized they weren't my enemies. They were just people caught in the story of a man who had built his life on lies, just like I had built mine on escape. I stayed there until sunset. When the guests began to leave, I stepped out of the car. My hands were shaking, my legs weak, but I crossed the street anyway. The woman turned when she heard my steps. For a second, her eyes narrowed, like she was trying to place me. Then she smiled faintly, mistaking me for one of the neighbors. "Did you know him?" she asked, her voice calm, kind, unsuspecting. I nodded. "Once," I said. "A long time ago." She looked down at the ground, then back at me. "He was a complicated man." I almost laughed. "Yes," I whispered. "He was." We stood there in silence, 2 widows in different stories. The air smelled of cut grass and fading roses. And for the first time, I felt no anger, no fear, only the strange, fragile peace of something finally ending. When I got back to the car, I didn't start it right away. I took out the photograph from my wallet, the one of my son, smiling in front of the diner when he was little, and held it against my chest. "You're free," I whispered. "We both are," but as I drove away from that house, I knew freedom wasn't an ending. It was a reckoning. And mine was still waiting. I am 75 now. My hands shake when I pour my morning coffee, and the steam fogs the window of the small apartment I've lived in for almost 30 years. The city outside hums like an old song, buses sighing, neighbors arguing, the world still spinning as if it never noticed I once disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if anyone remembers Helen Miller at all. The newspapers, the fake funeral, the whispers, they've all turned to dust by now. But I remember. Every detail, every sound, every silence. My son calls every Sunday, just like he promised he would. He has 2 children now, my grandchildren, and every time I hear their voices through the phone, high and unguarded, I think about the life they'll never have to escape from. I think about the chain I broke, the curse I refused to pass down. He still doesn't know everything. He knows his father died long ago, that his mother had to start over, that love, sometimes, is a kind of survival. But he doesn't know about the river, or the letter, or the woman buried under my name. I used to wonder if I should tell him. But now I think some truths are meant to stay in the ground with the ghosts they belong to. I keep a small box in the closet, my only inheritance to myself. Inside are the fragments of every life I've lived, the baby blanket, a diner receipt dated 1986, the silver ring I once wore before I let it fall to the bus floor, and a photograph of a grave with my own name on it. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I take the ring out and roll it between my fingers. The metal is cold, like the hand of a stranger. I no longer know whether it belonged to me or to the woman I buried. People say forgiveness is freedom, but they never tell you that sometimes freedom comes first, and forgiveness follows years later, limping, exhausted. I used to think I'd never forgive him. How could I? The bruises, the fear, the lies, they built the walls of my entire life. But as I sit here, old and soft and nearly invisible to the world, I find that I no longer feel anger when I think of him. Just distance. He was a storm, and I was the house that somehow didn't collapse. The rain has stopped now. The roof still holds. Last month, I went back to the river. It was quieter than I remembered, the air thick with summer and the smell of wet earth. I brought flowers. Not for him, for her. The woman I used to be. I stood at the edge where I once left my shoes and whispered, "You did it. You made it out," I cried. But it wasn't grief. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the bruises that faded, for the lies that forced me to build a new name, for the son who grew up knowing only gentleness. When I looked down at the water, I saw my reflection, older, wrinkled, but alive. For the first time, I didn't see shame in those eyes. I saw endurance. I saw a woman who had died once and lived twice. I smiled. Sometimes people ask me if I ever fell in love again. I tell them yes, but not with a man. I fell in love with quiet mornings, with sunlight through lace curtains, with the small mercy of peace. I fell in love with myself, the version that was left after the fire burned everything else away. Before I go to sleep each night, I whisper the same words I said to my son all those years ago. We're safe now, only this time. It's not a promise. It's a truth. And if anyone ever finds this, if anyone reads these words after I'm gone, I hope they understand one thing. Survival isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision to keep walking through it, barefoot, until you find a place that feels like home. Because sometimes you have to bury yourself to be reborn. And sometimes the life that begins after death is the only one that truly belongs to you.